1 Thessalonians 4:11-12. And to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, you should mind your own business and work with your hands just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. Hello, family. This is episode 3 of the Black Psychological Perspective. Sociology is the environment and how it affects people. Psychology is how people's reaction to the environment. These are two words that's used loosely in our community, but nobody really understands the definition of them and their procedures. When you diagnose someone with a mental health issue, you have to be culturally competent. A mental health issue is determined by someone's acting outside that normal dictates of their culture. Now, for someone to be acting outside the normal dictates of their culture, that means that the person that's doing the observation has to be culturally competent. They have to be culturally competent about the culture to be able to say that someone's acting outside the dictates of their culture. This is where the problem lies, because many of the people who do the observations, who are the people who are supposed to have the degrees and have the credentials to do the observation, are not culturally competent to be able to diagnose someone with mental illness, to be able to say they're acting outside the dictates of their character. The nuances of culture vary. And I'm going to use an example of Harlem. Harlem is a place that's 45 blocks. There's 45 blocks and about 7 avenues. Now, these 45 blocks and 7 avenues have different cul-de-sacs inside of it. Every area has their own way of being, has their own way of doing things. They even have their own slang. So what happens is that if you're from the west side of Harlem and you're not culturally competent in understanding how somebody from the east side of Harlem operates, then you might misdiagnose that person, being that you feel that they're outside the dictates of the cultural contents that you know. But you're not from the east side of Harlem. You're from the west side of Harlem. So there's different nuances that are associated. Even though we're in the same 45 blocks, we still associate with different nuances. We still experience things at different times of time. Just as simple as that, or the sunny side of the Ave, or the shady side of the avenue. You know what I mean? Anybody who knows Harlem knows that you walk on the shady side or the sunny side. Or you walk on the uptown side, you walk on the downtown side. These are things that, if you're not culturally competent to understand Harlem and the nuances associated with Harlem, you might misdiagnose someone because you may think they're speaking out of context. This is why we have to be educated consumers. We're consuming these products and these titles and these things, but we are not actually aware of the total definition of them, the modality of it. So being that we're not aware of the modality, we digest this information, and then we spew it out, unbeknownst to us. Now we're becoming the very thing that someone introduced to us. We weren't that before, but then all of a sudden now we're bipolar, now we're ADHD, now we're schizophrenic, now we have all these diagnoses. But what happens is that 50 years ago, schizophrenia was primarily a white woman's disease, defined almost as a feigning disease by older white women. It wasn't until the 1960s when they had all the protests in Detroit and Philadelphia and all the protests after the Civil Rights Movement. We had the generation that spawned the Black Panthers that they started using schizophrenia and making it a black man's disease. A Caucasian brother named Jonathan Metzl wrote Protest Psychosis. Protest Psychosis is a book about how schizophrenia became a black disease. So what happens is that we have to start understanding the history of psychology. We have to start understanding the history of mental illness and sociology before we start embracing titles that further stagnate us and further stigmatize us. What we don't understand that mental illness, the whole mental illness game and the gamut was for them to put a definition on black people, because we're not in the cultural context of the dominant society. We have our own cultural context. So what happens is mental illness is determined on the fact that are we working inside the cultural context of mainstream society? Thing is, how is mainstream society going to impose its cultural context upon us? Bipolar and related disorders. Bipolar is a bridge between two diagnostic classes, schizophrenia class and psychotic depressive disorders. Bipolar disorder represents the modern understanding of classic manic depressive disorder or affective psychosis described in the 19th century, differing from the classic description only to the extent that neither psychosis nor the lifetime experience of a major depressive episode is a requirement. However, the vast majority of individuals whose symptoms meet the criteria for a fully syndromal manic episode also experience major depressive episodes during the course of their lives. Bipolar II disorder, requiring the lifetime experience of at least one episode of major depression and at least one hypomanic episode, is no longer thought to be a milder condition than bipolar I, largely because instability of mood experience, usually accompanied with serious impairment in work or social function. Post-traumatic stress disorder, diagnostic criteria: exposure to actual threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Experience repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic events, e.g. first responders collecting human remains, police officers repeatedly exposed to the details of child abuse. Intense, prolonged psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic events. Avoidance of efforts to avoid external reminders, people, places, conversations, activities, objects, situations that arouse distressing memories, thoughts or feelings about or closely associated with the traumatic events. There are 5 variations of PTSD. What we just heard was the definition of PTSD from the Diagnostic Statistical Manual on Mental Illness. And from that definition, we all have PTSD. You need to understand 2 phrases: standard of care and informed consent. Standard of care is based on what other doctors do. Standard of care is when doctors misdiagnose someone, or doctors do malpractice, or doctors do something that wrong that do you bodily harm, because the Hippocratic Oath means to do no harm. When a doctor becomes a doctor, they have that MD. They have the caduceus symbol attached to his name. He has to take the Hippocratic Oath. And the Hippocratic Oath means to do no harm. All doctors, their intentions are not supposed to do any harm. So what happens is that with the standard of care, if a doctor does something that hurts you, or does something that malpractice, or something, or misdiagnosis with mental illness, and gives you the medication or drugs that end up hurting you, there's nothing you can do about it, because based on the standard of care, based on what other doctors do, so they're gonna go see what other doctors do, and other doctors do the same exact thing. So what ends up happening is that now you don't have any rebuttal because it's based on the standard of care. Now, informed consent, you have to know the drugs prescribed to you, how the treatment worked, and how long they've been around. These are the things that you have to know.